Chapter 7. Xana's Decision. The Hermitage's semi-basement was made up of a long corridor to which a number of storerooms and rooms were connected. One of these was a refrigerator room that had not seen light for many years, which led to the secret room in which Hopper had built a scanner to use to enter the mirror in the first city. Aside from the secret passage through the sewers, the only exit from the basement was in the house's garage, from which could be accessed the living room and the large garden. Odd, Yumi, and Richard remained hidden, waiting for the adults to finish a quick exploration. Professor Hertz returned to the basement several minutes later. "Come with me. I'll accompany you to the secret room. Michael has already set to work on the scanner to get your friends out. You'll stay with him. Be silent and courteous, and wait for the rest of us to take care of all the rest." The youngsters nodded. The professor behind them acting as a protective shield, they left the tiny room and ran towards the refrigerator room. From one end of the corridor, Lone Wolf watched them, gun in hand. Memory had left to bring them hot tea and was now stealing a glance at the boy with glasses through the steam from her cup. Jeremy was 13, while her daughter would already be around 23 years old. Memory couldn't believe it. Alita should already be a grown woman by now. The last time she had seen her, she had been very small, and throughout all these long years, her mother, had forgotten her. How could she have? Since she had awoken from being unconscious, Memory had received rapid glimpses, visions, of a past that she never seemed to have lived. She remembered a military base. She had worked there at her husband Waldo's side. He was robust, had a beard, and they had a daughter together, her darling Alita. Then, a soldier named Mark Hollenbeck had kidnapped her, and, continuously on the road, had taken her from one prison to the other for many years. She had then been locked in a hidden cabin in the National Park of Mercantor, in the French Alps, and she had been stranded somewhere in England, and later in Morocco. The soldier, who had adopted the name Hannibal Mago, had forced her to work for the Green Phoenix, his criminal organization. She had rebelled against him, because all she wanted was to find her husband and daughter again, and each time, after a while, when she thought she would never make it, her necklace would glow. It was Waldo, telling her that he was still thinking of her and always loved her. She responded to him in the same way. It was a simple and silent method of contact that allowed her to remain hopeful for a very long time. She remembered one scene in particular from this period of time. It was the 2nd of May, 1994. Mago had forced her into her room with a chair and a camera. He had bound her hands and forced her to record a message for her husband. He wanted to force him to commence work on Project Carthage for him, but in this message, she had pleaded for him to flee, and Mago had knocked her out to render her unconscious. Less than a month later, something happened. Grigory Noctopoulos had entered her room. For once, he wasn't accompanied by his 2 dogs and was wearing a strange pair of leather gloves with a screen on the back and long, colored cables leading from the fingers. The man had placed his hands on her head, and she had lost her name. She had become Memory. She had lost her past, and from that moment on became Mago's assistant. How had Grigory managed to erase her memory of the past? Who was she really? What was her name? And why is it that for more than a dozen years the necklace had never lit up, not even once, to signal to her that Waldo and Alita were well and was still thinking of her? Memory finished drinking her tea and placed the cup on one of the console screens. Jeremy turned to her. "Anthea, look," he said. Memory stared at him, eyes wide. That was her real name, Anthea. The refrigerator room was a square room with an enormous airtight door. Large metal hooks hung from the ceiling, and on the walls were large empty shelves. Several ventilation shafts embedded in the walls served to cool the room using a gigantic motor in another room, but currently it was rather warm. On the back wall, a brick door had slid up on invisible railings to reveal a tiny passageway that led to a lit room. I'm leaving you here," Professor Hertz announced, lowering the barrel of her gun. "Try not to break anything or cause any problems." Yumi nodded. She still couldn't get her mother's look of reproach out of her head, and was beginning to think it was a mistake to come here. Odd had always been the slightly goofy jester of the group. Since when had he become a warped plan maker? It was obvious that if there was one thing he could do, it was get them in trouble. Richard, Odd, and the young girl bade goodbye to the professor and ducked their heads to enter the secret room. It was a small, empty space containing only a sofa and an old television. One of the walls had a large opening in it, made by the end of a pick, through which they could see yet another room with a command post and a scanner column inside, the latter which looked somewhat like a shower cubicle. Mr. Belpois was already working on the computer. Yumi approached, distractedly running her fingers along the surface of the column. Once inside, she could be virtualized inside the mirror or the first city, and she could free her friends. "How's it going?" she asked Jeremy's father. The man gave her a warm smile. Michael Belpois very much resembled his son. He wore the same round glasses and had the same blonde hair, although it was beginning to grow sparser on the top of his head, leaving a bald patch. "Well, I'm trying to remember how this thing works," he explained to her. "It's been years since I laid my hands on a terminal like this one." "I'm sorry," Yumi said, returning his smile. "I'm not very good with... I'm sure that Jeremy would know what to do, although if you want, I could try to lend a hand." Michael offered up his place in front of the keyboard. "Go on, Odd approved, enthusiastically encouraging Yumi. Get in contact with Aelita right away! It was at that moment the children heard gunfire. Xana was invisible. Ulrich and Eva were in a small clearing among the trees, and the artificial intelligence was floating all around them. It permeated the air, living in the tree trunks so tall their canopies were lost in the clear, monotone sky, and hidden in the immeasurable emerald green carpet of the woods, and it observed. Its manta rays had taken the children to a clearing near one of the towers, an enormous candle planted in the ground by a tangle of dark roots. Through these Lyoko towers, Xana could interact with the real world. Use its power to infiltrate the electrical network of any nation on Earth and deactivate or destroy it. Or he could even exploit its incredible energy to save the two children and bring them to safety. They seemed so fragile to him. They were talking to each other calmly without noticing his presence. He could have launched an army of monsters upon them and destroyed them. With a simple click of his fingers, he could have reduced their life points to nothing and sent them back to reality. But he hadn't done it. Xana was a very advanced program, and he couldn't feel uncertainty or confusion in the human sense of the words. Xana compiled data, fed it into complex statistical matrices, ran simulations and analyzed the results. And at that moment, however, the creature couldn't decide how to act. All his projections advised him to maintain his alliance with the Green Phoenix. He had to help the terrorists conquer the world, destroy all the Earth's communications, and overthrow its governments. At the end of this destructive procedure, it wouldn't be hard for him to get rid of Mego and become the absolute master of the world. But this success would have a price. It meant the defeat and probably the death of Aelita and her young friends, and Xana couldn't accept that. This simple loss, such a marginal one, stirred something within him. Blocking his logical processes was something that resembled rage. Could this be the virus Jeremy was talking about? Or perhaps he is no longer a simple and cold computer program? Xana condensed himself, uniting the matter on the Lyoko to adopt a human form. Upon seeing the black-haired boy appear before him, Ulrich leapt up and slid his hands onto the handle of his katana. "There you are," he exclaimed. "If I wanted to hurt you," commented Xana, with a smile, "I wouldn't have chosen this fragile appearance." He turned towards Eva. "How is my young assistant doing?" "Well, thank you," the girl responded unsteadily. "Excellent. Until Jeremy and I agree on a plan of action, you shall be my guests. If you need something, you need only ask." At that moment, Xana felt an incoming communication. It was coming from the factory command post, but it wasn't Jeremy. It was Mego in person. The boy turned to Ulrich. "The boss of the Green Phoenix wants to speak to me. You can listen in on the conversation, but you must remain silent. He cannot know that you're here." Ulrich nodded, and Xana stretched out an arm to draw a square in the air. Suddenly a screen appeared, floating a meter above the ground. In the frame, they could see the face of Hannibal Mego. "Pleased to see you again," said the boss of the Green Phoenix. He smiled, and his mouth opened, clearly displaying his golden canine teeth. Odd jumped. At his side, Yumi and Michael Belpois stood up, and the three of them turned to the entrance of the secret room. Richard, who had stayed by the side of the hole the whole time, had his back pressed against the wall and was having trouble breathing. They heard more gunfire, the sound of objects being thrown to the floor, and shouting in French and other languages. The alarm had been raised. The men of the Green Phoenix had noticed they were there. "Richard!" Odd cried. "Run to the door of the refrigerator room and get ready to close it if you see an enemy soldier." "Yes." "Yumi, open the communication to the mirror or the first city. Whichever. We just have to get our friends out of there." The girl got back to work on the computer, helped by Jeremy's father. We're connected to the first city," said Michael Belpois, shaking his head, "but the scanner isn't picking up any human life forms." Yumi's fingers trembled on the keyboard, and her friend ran to her side. "Don't worry," he whispered. "You'll see. Ulrich and Eva will be fine. I'm sure there's a logical explanation. Meanwhile, try to get in contact with Aelita." "Got it," responded the girl, hammering her fingers against the keys. Odd stayed for a moment to observe the monitors, forcing himself to ignore the battle sounds coming from outside. He could hear the barking of dogs. "Aha!" exclaimed Michael joyfully. "I've just found Aelita. We'll have an audio-visual connection in a second." The screen trembled from the interference, contaminating the transmission like a curtain of sparks. Then the image cleared to show the entrance to the factory, beside an elevator leading to the underground floors. Aelita was with a young boy with black hair. They saw her lift her head and put a hand to her ear. "Is someone there?" she asked. "Aelita, it's me, Odd. How are you doing? Has Xana—" No. Everything's fine. I could even say Xana and I have become friends." Odd opened his eyes wide as saucers, stupefied. Yumi leaned towards the computer screen. "Aelita, we don't have much time," she interrupted. "We can't find Ulrich and Eva in the first city. Do you know what happened to them?" "They're safe and sound on Lyoko. Xana gave them refuge," responded the pink-haired girl. "Okay," Odd exclaimed. "For now, we're going to get you out of the mirror. Get ready." Aelita tried to babble a response, but Odd became distracted by an uproar coming from the next room. The Green Phoenix soldiers had made it inside. Hannibal Mego explained to Xana that a group of people from Caddock had infiltrated the Hermitage with the help of the men in black. The young man observed Ulrich and Eva out of the corner of his eye. They were seated on the ground, concerned and frightened. Was saving them really so important to him? "What do you want of me?" he asked the boss of the Green Phoenix. "You could be a little friendlier," Mago responded, shaking his head. "After all, we're now associates. Anyway, here's what I want. Create more robot soldiers immediately, and make them come out to the Hermitage scanner to help my men. Meanwhile, I want to create a little chaos in the city, to give them a small taste of what's to come. Make all the traffic lights on all the roads red, to cause a string of accidents everywhere. Cut the electrical power. Screw up the radio communications of the police, the army, the firefighters. Well, you get what I'm going for. I want Dido to know that I'm not kidding around when I tell her to stay away." Xena knew that this moment would have come sooner or later. In the meantime, he had tried to buy time. He had helped Aelita and, as much as possible, Ulrich and Eva. But he had not personally exposed himself. Xena wasn't even a person in a strict sense. He was a digital entity that was currently divided in two. The first half, the one in Lyoko, possessed almost unlimited power and the cold, clear-sightedness of a computer, while the other, the weaker half, was still prisoner in the mirror and had begun to develop something new, emotions. But now he had to make a decision. Should he help Mago and become the most powerful digital creature in Earth's history? Or should he help the children by giving in to this strange human component that he still didn't completely understand? In a fraction of a second, the artificial intelligence activated hundreds of simulation programs within himself and analyzed the results. Remaining by the side of the terrorists would mean absolute power, and yet... "No," he replied. The screen showed the smile vanish from Mago's face. "My friend, allow me to explain to you how this works. I have more than one trick up my sleeve." Mago opened his hand, showing his palm. On it was a small black plastic box with a single red button on it, covered by a transparent cover. "All I have to do is to press this button and poof! Supercomputer extinguished, and you'll be trapped inside once again." Xena shrugged. He had already made a decision, and for the first time in his life, he felt a sense of calm coming directly from the part of him that was listening from inside the mirror. I also have some trump cards," he responded calmly. "For example, I can use the towers on the Lyoko to enter your brain, and I assure you that it is not a pleasant experience." From the other side of the screen, in the clearing, Eva nodded firmly. "So we're equal," Xana continued. "Both of us have a gun pointed at the other's head, but that's not why I don't want to help you. I simply can't do it." This was absolutely false, but Xana now had to lie. Jeremy had asked him to pretend he was an ally of the Green Phoenix until the right moment, and, according to his statistical projections, that moment had not yet come. "Creating robot soldiers is very tiring," the young boy explained. "The Yoko's energy resources are still recharging. If you don't believe me, you can ask Jeremy. As soon as I'm ready for action again, I'll let you know." The final image the screen showed before dissolving into thin air was Hannibal Mago slamming his fist on the table. The airtight door opened on all sides, and Richard was sent flying through the air, hitting the cement wall back first. Hertz entered the room like a whirlwind, aiming her gun at the other side of the metal door. The sound of gunfire echoed like thunder through the refrigerator room. Richard moaned in pure fear, while the woman continued to shoot without turning around. "Close the door!" she ordered. These words acted on Richard like a spring. He quickly climbed up the shelves, reaching the hooks hanging from the ceiling and pulled on them, moving them. He then turned to Hertz and noticed a soldier in camouflage uniform behind her, 2 heads taller than her, face covered by a black balaclava and a submachine gun in his hands. Richard wanted to yell, run towards her to help her, but his muscles were contracted and fully resisted the idea of moving. He remained rooted to the spot, watching with eyes wide open as the professor flipped her weapon in her hand and struck the soldier's jaw with the butt. He heard the cracking of broken bones. Then the woman turned on one leg, hitting the man with the heel of her other leg as she corrected her grip on the gun, raising her arm and shooting another soldier approaching through the corridor. "Richard!" she yelled. The young man bounded towards her and helped her close off the refrigerator room, barricading the door with metal hooks they'd taken off the ceiling. They made it just in time. An instant later, they saw the furious faces of soldiers pressing against the small reinforced glass window. The terrorists began to push and slam against the door. "By a hair," the young man murmured. He noticed Yumi stick her head out through the small door leading to the secret room and observed the professor perplexedly. "What happened? Where are the others?" asked the girl. Hertz stuck her gun between her wetsuit and belt before shaking her head. "They were captured. The Green Phoenix agents outnumber us, so they were forced to surrender." "My parents too?" Yumi asked, voice trembling. I'm sorry, the woman said, nodding.